So I'm Chris. I'm an occupational therapist. I graduated from college in 1989, UW-Madison. It's hard to believe because I still think of myself like in my 30s, like at the most, but I've been a therapist for over 30 years, so I don't know how that works. I don't feel like I've been doing it that long. So yeah, I've mostly seeing kids with autism, ADHD, a lot of kids that have been adopted, foster care, a lot of kids with sensory issues. I wanted to make some things clearer today that I didn't know was an issue until I did a presentation. And one of my definitions is my kids. When I say my kids, I am 99.9% of the time not talking about my own biological children. I am talking about your kids. When I say my kids, typically I'm saying these types of kids that I see. Typically I see a lot of kids with autism and sensory issues and adoption, the ones I've mentioned, ADHD. When I say your kids, I may not be talking about your kids. I mean, all the kids like your kids, you know what I mean? Like, and as I know other therapists, I think Emily from Owl Therapies here, I think you might ask me, like, who are your kids? Like, the first time we met. And I've said that to other therapists too, like, oh, I saw one of your kids today. Like, these are the kinds of kids you see. Yes, yes. So it's my kids, probably not my kids. I have 3 kids, they're full grown. I did do a presentation and a mom came up to me after and she goes, so how old are your kids with autism and how many kids do you have with autism? And I'm like all of them, because my kids don't have autism, just so you know. If I say my kids, I'm talking about your kids. If I say your kids, I'm talking about all the kids like your kids. Occupational therapy, and it's important to me to tell you what occupational therapy is. Do you guys feel like you have a good definition of occupational therapy, other than the occupational therapists in here?
Do the slider like rigid, like good definition. I don't know anything about it. Somewhere in between.
What do you guys think? Do you have a solid understanding of occupational? I will tell you, until a few years ago, I was probably like this. You know, I'm an OT. It's not till I had some of my own problems that I realized really what we did and how important it was. But what I tell people now is when somebody has an illness, an injury, a mood disorder, chronic pain, developmental disorder, autism, ADHD, a lot of times their world gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And they stop doing all the things that they can do, all the things they love to do, and all the things they need to do. Or maybe they didn't start them because of some disability. Occupational therapists as a profession recognize the importance of keeping your world out here. We do not want your world to shrink. And that's going to be important. I'm going to come back to this definition in my presentation later. Do you need me to do anything yet? Or are we good?
No, we just don't have an HDMI for everybody in here to see your screen.
Okay. We can do this
Come
one
up
too.
Close.
So we want your world to be out here. That's occupational therapy. Well, the other thing I say is that it's not a job. I've gotten kicked out of people's rooms in the hospital because they say, oh, I already have a job, I don't need you. No, when we say occupational therapy, we mean all the things that occupy your time in your day. We don't want it down here, we want it out here. It's important, especially when I get to nurturing the window of tolerance. So are people familiar with the window of tolerance? Not me. I thought I knew what the window of tolerance was when I said I was going to do this talk. So when I thought the window of tolerance is something I use all the time. And when I was doing a little homework for my presentation, I realized the window of tolerance is used more in trauma. And what we talk about a lot in autism is the optimal level of arousal. I'm gonna have a really hard time doing this without a screen. So the optimal level of arousal. So I will use those interchangeable. Window of tolerance, more of a trauma term. optimal level of arousal, more of an autism term. It's not a big deal. It is when I looked up some of the information on window of tolerance. But actually, I'm going to give you my definition of window of tolerance that I looked up and found for you guys. I'm going to read it to you since you can't see it up there. The window of tolerance or optimal arousal level is a concept often discussed in the context of sensory processing in individuals with autism spectrum disorder. It refers to an optimal range of sensory input or stimulation within which an individual can effectively process and respond to sensory information without becoming overwhelmed or dysregulated. The concept is also relevant to individuals without ASD as it pertains to general human capacity to manage sensory input. So what it's saying is simply that place, you know, where you're in your zone, where you feel good, where you can respond to your world the way you need to, in an expected way. And that could be very different, right? Right now, I need to respond in one way. If I'm at an amusement park, I need to respond in another way. So it's that ability to respond, that optimal arousal level. Is where we can respond to how we need to in our environment. I have pictures of all of this, they're really good. So what can happen with that level of arousal, that window? We can be over aroused, right? We can be hyper aroused. Up here, if here's your level of arousal, we can be hypo aroused, we can be optimal level, we can be over aroused. And it's important because when we're in that optimal level of arousal, that's where we want to be for school, right? That is what I'm thinking about. I almost always draw the window of tolerance or the optimal level of arousal for my parents, like the second or third session. I'm like, let's figure out where your kid is. Your kid over aroused? Are they under aroused? Where are they? My goal is that they can be in their optimal level of arousal most of the time, right? None of us is perfect, but I don't know. Hopefully this will make some sense. This is the window of tolerance, and I only included it because the optimal level of arousal, my pictures of that are much more simple than this, but I thought it was interesting. In trauma, they talk about shutdown, and in optimal level of arousal, we talk about shutdown. The way I learned about shutdown, you guys know about fight, flight, or freeze? Yes? Shutdown is like beyond that. Like your nervous system is like, I'm done. Like I can't do it anymore. And it shuts down. Interesting. I think it's super interesting. So in the window of tolerance documentation, they put that under arousal, which I think is like, no, you guys got it wrong. Because it is, and it's important to know this, I mean, as a therapist and as a parent too, that when your child is in shutdown, they're hyper aroused. They are so aroused that they're up here, like they can't respond because they're so aroused. So it's important to know that and think of it that way, because if you do something, you want to do something calming for that child, if they're under aroused, we're going to try to bring them up. So we don't want to think of it in those terms. Also, we want to realize that if a child is in shutdown and we do something calming, it might look not so pretty because they're still in hyperarousal. So if we have somebody in shutdown and we calm them down, they got to go through all that hyperarousal before they get to the optimal zone. So I just thought that was interesting. I haven't like looked at it that in depth before because I always just had my optimal arousal information. It's much more simple. We have our over arousal, we have our optimal level of arousal, and our under arousal. Everything making sense so far? Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about over arousal.
Can I ask one question? So the window of tolerance, why is that a trauma term? What,
It's just the way it was defined by the people who I think Dan Siegel, and the information I have, and who knows, there might be different information. Dan Siegel does a lot with trauma work, and he calls it the window of tolerance.
Okay.
All the sensory therapists that I know call it the optimal level of arousal. It's not important, it's just, it's interesting to me that, and I probably wouldn't have brought it up except that the way they put the check down, you guys know, you don't put check down and under arousal. It's not like, that's not how the nervous system works, although he's very good at the nervous system. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, because we're gonna talk about that. We'll talk about the optimal level of arousal as a sensory therapist, right? So when somebody's in high arousal, they want everything to stay the same. They get very rigid. My nervous system is getting too much input. I need everything to stay the same. Don't change anything. Don't put my cereal in a different color bowl. I had a family who their son woke up, and after he went to bed the night before, they had rearranged the furniture. And he woke up and had the biggest meltdown they've ever seen, and he would not stop melting down until they put the furniture back. Like, my nervous system is already up here. I cannot do this. I can't take change in my world. They like predictability. They can be hypervigilant, right? I need everything to stay the same. If anything's different. These are the kids that come into my room. I am not hypervigilant. They come into my room, they're like, oh, we have a light out. Like they would come in here and know if there's a light out. Or if there's a spot on the ceiling somewhere, they would come in and tell me, like, Chris, you got a light out. I'm like, what? And I'd be working there all week and not notice, right? So they're hypervigilant. They can be very avoidant, very controlling. They're very protective and guarded. So these are some things you can see. Obviously, every child is going to be somewhere in there. What's interesting is when we think about hyperarousal, a lot of times we think about kids that are bouncing off the wall. They're so hyper, they're hyperaroused, they're bouncing off the wall. But you can have a child that's low activity, but hyperaroused. They're like, don't touch me. On guard. You can feel these kids. Like, I just had one the other day. It's the first time I saw her, and her mom, and I'm like, I don't see anything wrong with her. Like, she's so good. And then her mom's like, yeah, but when she blows, she blows. Like, she is just like, she's right in there, right under that, you know, that high arousal where she's gonna blow. And she's just like, she's managing, she's keeping everything the same, doing whatever she can. But she might be very low activity level. She's not gonna do a lot because she don't want anything changing in her world. So, so they're like, don't touch me. They want to be left alone. They isolate. They're trying to minimize interaction and stimulation. They may appear distractible because they're aware of everything, right? Got to be on guard. When you're on guard, you're aware of everything. It's part of that fight or flight, right? If you're in fight or flight, you're going to be aware of everything that's going on. You're in survival mode. They may miss things in the environment because they're so aware of they have so much to keep track of that they're going to miss stuff, right? So when you got to think about when they're in that hyper arousal zone, they're going to have a hard time learning in school, right? They hear the kid drop their pencil 2 rooms away. They hear an ambulance, how many miles before anybody else. They have their senses on everything. They proceed with caution because they might have missed something. Yeah, they're kind of aware of it, like they're realizing they're missing stuff, but then they got to pay attention to everything. That makes any sense? And they get frustrated when you interrupt them because I am paying attention to everything here, trying to keep track of the teacher, to keeping track of that ambulance, seeing if it's getting closer. Somebody dropped a pencil over there. They're keeping track, and then you interrupt them. So like, oh, like I'm trying to keep all this together, and now you interrupted me. You don't, despite the fact that they're up here, you don't want to withhold stimulation, but you need to think about how you give them the stimulation. They need it to be in an organized way. People that are in hyperarousal tend to like very rhythmical input. Deep pressure for sure. So another high arousal, so that's high arousal, low activity. We also have high arousal, high activity. So these kids are in that zone, but they are like actively avoiding things like, no, you know, like I'm on the defensive and I'm gonna have a tantrum if you try to introduce new information. I'm gonna have a tantrum if you bring out a yellow bowl and I eat out of a blue bowl. I'm gonna have a tantrum when you change the living room furniture because I am actively resisting any more stimulation. I can't take any more stimulation. I'm gonna resist it. I'm not avoiding it, I'm resisting. These are the kids, they'll often get referred right away because they're like, they have behaviors, right? So we see a lot of these kids, they have a lot of behaviors. They may have emotional outbursts in order to avoid stimulation. They may actively withdraw. So they may be more withdrawing, but running away, like it's gonna be a behavior. They may create rituals for their daily life. We talked about that, the blue bowl, yellow bowl, gotta have the right bowl. They may be stubborn or controlling. They're gonna be more of the hitting, biting, scratching, tantruming, and again, actively avoiding further stimulation. What you wanna consider when you're seeing these kids is to honor their need to reduce that stimulation. We wanna honor that. We wanna say, hey, I see that this is overstimulating it. We wanna honor it. But I have a caveat that we're gonna talk about later when we talk about opening the window of tolerance, because we don't want, I don't think we want avoidance as a coping skill. I have to show you my picture. I don't know if you can see, there's a cat in there. The dog is doing therapy with the cat. It's a therapy dog and he's doing some deep pressure with the cat. So, people with high arousal tend to like deep pressure touch. They tend to benefit from deep pressure touch. I did something, my shoe is not gonna work. Okay. I said earlier, input needs to be rhythmical, predictable, and unchanging, consistent. We want to kind of keep things the same. Some kids are going to go, some of our low arousal kids are that's so boring, but our high arousal kids keep it the same. They benefit from tactile and deep pressure. Actually, not that you guys care, but I said I'm excited about this stuff. Deep pressure enhances dopamine, which assists with cortisol and cools the system off. I love brain stuff. Movement is slow and rhythmical. Swaddling, brushing, hand hugs, vibration. Also, your oral motor, your mouth is a huge, huge power sensation. So you can use that. You can use sucking and licking and blowing to kind of be very calming. What I always think about with the oral motor system is think about addictions. We have like addictions to food, addictions to chew, smoking, drinking. Your oral motor area is super, super powerful. You can use that. Okay. I have a couple quotes from Temple Grandin in here. She tended to be over aroused, I think. She talks about, I pulled away when people tried to hug me because being touched sent an overwhelming tidal wave of stimulation through my body. So she was so overstimulated. If you went and to hug her, not a good deal. She actually created this squeeze machine, which provides deep pressure, which goes on, because I just said that a good thing for people in hyperarousal is deep pressure touch. She doesn't like hugs. So it's important to realize, like with high arousal, yes, if they tolerate a hug, great, but the least threatening deep pressure input is something that they give to themselves. So a lot of my kids, we just start out having them give some deep pressure input to themselves. They might rock into their legs. I have a lot of kids who just, you know, and then we teach them, like, number one, a lot of parents and a lot of kids are already doing what they need to do. And then we kind of teach them to use that. Like, we all kind of do things we know and we don't even realize we're doing it. We teach them to use that, like, okay, deep pressure, that helps you calm down. So deep pressure that they give them to themselves is going to be the most tolerable or the least threatening. The next level is deep pressure given by something else. So I have a therapy ball here. I'll get a kid on a pillow and a mat, and I'll take my therapy ball and go over it. So that would be deep pressure with something else, right? I'm gonna, and I literally do this. I get on the therapy ball and roll right over them. So that is deep pressure. That's what a weighted blanket is. It's deep pressure from something else. I have kids, like, at the end of our therapy session, when we're maybe doing some fine motor tasks, I'll have them lay on their belly and throw a pillow on top of them, or a beanbag on top of them. That's deep pressure. Deep pressure given by another person is the most threatening. But if they tolerate it, great. Like, if you can tolerate it, a lot of times these kids will tolerate it when they initiate it. They'll initiate the hug, but they won't let you come in for a hug. Another Temple Grandin quote: when noise and sensory overstimulation become too intense, I was able to shut off my hearing and retreat into my own world. That's shut down. It's too much. I'm up here. Not down here. I'm up here. So if I calm down, I still got to go through that all the way down top to more Rosa. Oh, I have some good slides here. I just thought this was the coolest thing ever. It's like a couch with a weighted blanket. Oh.
I need a bed like that.
I know, I think that's why I saved it. This is a little, oh. What did it do? What did I do? Won't let me enlarge it. It's just a little bed tent. These were a big deal a few years ago, but now everybody has some kind of bed tent. So if I'm over aroused, hard to go to sleep. So that some of these kids, they'll sleep in the closet, right? They sleep in the closet, they create a corner, they sleep somewhere where they can make their world smaller. When you do the tent, you're recognizing that. You're like, oh, there's too much information in this room. It makes their world smaller so they can sleep. I brought out because we're going to talk about low arousal next. Does anybody have any questions about high arousal? We can always talk at the end too. So we're going to talk about under aroused now. So kids that are under aroused tend to have a low tone. They get bored easily no matter what. I'm bored. You got their favorite toy, and then they play with it once, and the next time I'm bored. They need a lot of change. They have difficulty sustaining attention, and they can be active or passive. Like when we said hyperarousal, we can have those low activity kids and high activity kids. Same thing with the low arousal. I probably don't get as many of the low arousal kids referred to me because they're going to be nice and easy to manage. You're gonna not be paying attention, but nobody's gonna care because they're not causing any trouble. So they're, just hanging out, propping their head up because they can't possibly hold their head up. So that's your low arousal kid.
Sounds a lot like me.
Well, here, you gotta listen then. We'll talk later. So the low arousal, we can have low arousal and low activity. So they're just gonna skate through their day. And they're probably gonna play too many video games and watch too many screens, but very super low arousal, low activity. Let's see. In the sensory world, they call them a needer. They need and a bystander. They need a lot of input, but they tend to be passive and not seeking. So they're not seeking to get the input, but they need it. these are the kids, like, I don't say everybody needs a therapy ball, but they would do well on a therapy ball. Because they're getting input and they don't even know it. Although, like, sometimes I think I'll get them on a therapy ball and they won't be able to slouch, but these kids can't. They can like slouch. Or on a T stool, if you've ever seen a T stool, you would think there's no way they can slouch on a T stool. They can. They can. They appear uninterested, flat, dull. They may appear apathetic and withdrawn, overly tired, self-absorbed. They miss things in the environment. They may have difficulty sustaining attention and performance. May appear bored, glazed, uninterested, tired. They tend to be low to the ground, slouch. They lean on something, lean on the table, lay on the table. These kids don't get caught, right? They're just gonna go through the system because they're not causing any trouble. And then everyone thinks they're bored and uninterested, so who cares, right? It's their fault, they're uninterested.
You appear interested in her,
Good.
for the act.
I love this stolen, totally stolen. It's a little kid on the phone. And he says, Jessica, listen, I know I've seemed a little dysregulated lately, but my OT session was canceled and I just haven't gotten the vestibular input that I need. He's got good slides. So what happens a lot, I shouldn't say a lot, I don't know how often it happens. There are kids that are low arousal that are bouncing off the walls. And here's the deal, and this is why it gets confusing. Because there's kids that are low arousal bouncing off the walls because your nervous system does not want to go any lower. It's like, I want to get up to my optimal zone. I don't want to go any lower. So they are bouncing off their walls. So everyone thinks they're hyper and need to calm down, but they need to calm up. They need activity to come up. So when you try to calm these kids down, they're going to get like agitated because their nervous system does not want to go any lower. I don't want to go any lower. I'm already low enough. But they look hyper, bouncing off the walls. Their arousal is low, so they need a lot of input to meet their optimal arousal level. They're very active in seeking input. I do get these kids referred to me. They add sensory input to everything. They make noise, fidget, chew on things, need to touch everything, wrap their body parts on people or objects. They appear excitable and seem to lack awareness for safety. They may climb on unsafe objects. Their activity level interferes with their task performance. So these guys do need a lot of, input. And that is why it's important to figure out like that. Are they hyper over aroused or are they hyper low arousal, right? Because they can look very similar. Are they low activity, low arousal? Or are they low activity, high arousal? Those kids you can feel. They feel like they're gonna blow at any minute. But just something to think about. I'll ask parents, and they probably think I'm crazy, but I'll be like, does your kid get bored easily? Does your child like things to change? That's a lower arousal. They're kind of seeking that change all the time. You change the room on them, they're gonna be happy about that, man, because that is gonna bring up their nervous system to that optimal arousal level. So they do not want predictability. They want change. They would do well on a ball. They like arrhythmical, unpredictable, and changing input. Vestibular input, movement input is really good. The movement input, we know movement input impacts arousal level. What do we do with our babies? Just gentle bouncing and rocking, very rhythmical. So very calming. What do we do when we go on the scrambler at the amusement park? And everyone's like, ah! Right? Because it gets your arousal level up. So vestibular movement sensation impacts your arousal level. These kids need some movement. They do not give the predictable, boring, rhythmical, boring, or attempt to calm them down. They need to calm up. You don't want to give verbal demands and punish a child when they're not able to sit still. It's interesting because I've been working, I know some of you look familiar. I've worked in peds for like 20 years, 25 years, went to Mayo and worked in mental health for several years, and then I'm coming back to peds. And it's interesting working in adult mental health because I see some of these that I would have seen as kids that maybe were missed. And for this one specifically, I'm thinking about this woman. She was kind of low arousal, and yet she was always like, I was interviewing her in her hospital room, and this is how she was on the edge of her bed. Like when I'm talking to her, like she's always got to have some input coming in. So pretty sure she was lower arousal, but kind of seeking to get up there to that optimal level of arousal. A lot of people who I talk to about this stuff, they're like, I wish I would have known about this when I was going through college. Like they're the kids that were always bouncing off the walls and getting in trouble. And they needed that input, but we could have figured out a way to get them that input without them getting in trouble. Anyway, it's been, kind of validating for me too, because you don't always feel like you're doing everything you want to be doing. Here's another great slide that I have. So it says, without enough sleep, we all become tall 2-year-olds, right? So so for me, I want to know, when I'm seeing a child, I want to know how do I get them to their optimal arousal level? Another thing that happens though, let me see, I want to get back. I don't know. I want to get back to the slide. Okay. So, optimal arousal level. I want this window to be wide. Most of the kids I see, they have this tiny little optimal arousal level. They're bouncing out of it all the time, right? So even if we're doing everything, they still just have this little optimal arousal level and they're bouncing out of that. So what I want to just talk about briefly is how do we open that? Well, also, one thing I want to say before I say that is think about your own optimal arousal level, right? When are you at your best? And when are you at your worst? I don't know why it came back. This came back to me just recently. It's kind of a funny story. But this was way, many, many years ago before I was married. It was my first job out of college. It was cool. I smell. And my coworkers liked me, but anytime I tried to quit smoking, they'd say, Chris, just keep smoking. Because my window of tolerance is like this when I tried to quit smoking. They're like, don't quit, just stop quitting. Because I was always quitting. Anyway, think about yourself. I can tell you another time, way more information than you need to know, but when I went through menopause, I went through early menopause. My poor children, I'm pretty sure they were traumatized by my menopause, but I had no window of tolerance. Okay, so we all go through this. We kind of manage, we figure it out and we manage, but our children don't have that opportunity, right? Because they're very seldom in a good place to figure it out, right? So things that help, and it's a lot of the foundational stuff, sleep. So when I start seeing a child and I usually see them because they're dysregulated or they're having behaviors, are they getting enough sleep? So, and obviously, if you guys could get your kids enough sleep, you would, right? Like, yeah, duh. But so we want to figure that out. Like one of the first things, let's figure out sleep. How are we going to get them sleeping better? nutrition. And again, we have picky eaters, right? They only eat white foods. They only eat like the high carbs. They need protein. Protein's gonna help open that window of tolerance. Carbs, like high carbs, they're gonna keep you bouncing around, right? They're gonna keep you bouncing out of that window. We want protein. So we're gonna work on those and we're gonna think about those things first. I can't get your child regulated if they're not sleeping and they're eating a bunch of white food and sugar, right? Physical activity. If your child is sensory defensive and they want to minimize interaction, they're not going to want to be physically active. If they're a low arousal kid, they're not going to want to be physically active. So we got to figure that out. How can we get them more physical activity? It's going to be good for sleep. It's always also going to be good for, obviously, mental health. We're going to do sensory activities. Again, the deep pressure, kind of recognizing what your child needs. And I will tell you, the vast majority of parents, and they don't think they know what they're doing, but I come into the house and they're like, I remember when I was working in birth to 3, and this family said, can we go and do the OT eval out on they had a huge trampoline, because they do so much better when they're bouncing. and they didn't think they knew what they're doing. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's like totally a sensory diet right there. So parents tend to know what they're doing. It's just like, when I start explaining why to do those things, they're like, the guy's doing the right stuff all the while. Yeah. But now I know why, and I can use that, right? When we know why we're doing something, we can use it and strengthen that. Diaphragmatic breathing. I was a huge skeptic. I actually wouldn't have brought up diaphragmatic breathing until I worked in mental health at Mayo, but I have seen amazing things. I've heard amazing things. When I do breathing with kids, I'm not like giving them my whole spiel about how it impacts the fight or flight system and the parasympathetic system and the sympathetic nervous system, but we can do fun things and work on breathing. So I have some of these here today. You probably saw the kids walking around with them, but it also works on visual skills. Sweet. So we're gonna work on doing some breathing. Just like simple stuff, like when you inhale, your heart rate goes up a little bit. When you exhale, your heart rate goes down a little bit. So we want a little bit more exhale than inhale. So when I give these to the kids, I say, see how long you can keep that ball in there. So you get a nice long exhale. These are super cool, and I only brought them to show off because it's the exact same thing. And also because I can't get them anymore. So if you see them anywhere, let me know.
Ooh.
Oh. So I have those. You can use a straw. You can blow a feather. You can blow a ping pong ball. You can, across the table. When I'm teaching young kids at the hospital, I say, see if you can blow on the feather and move all its little things without blowing it off your hand. So I get that nice long exhale. So I don't, we do want children to realize, oh, how did that feel? Are you more calm now? So diaphragmatic breathing is huge. They are still finding the benefits of breathing in through your nose. Like, I think that is so cool. Like, I love that stuff. You think we know everything, but we don't. Like, breathing through the nose, you think people know stuff about that, but we're still learning. I've said this a couple times, but just awareness. Like, sometimes I feel like a fraud because people are like, oh, you've done so much for me. And I'm like, I haven't done anything. But I think when you start realizing like, oh, I do know, and this awareness is huge. And for your children too, like those people, and it breaks my heart that, some of the adults I've seen in mental health, but when I explain their sensory system to them, and they're like, oh, that makes so much sense. And it's validating for them. It's sad because they've already not made it through college, but when we tell them and, you know, kind of empower them in that, like, oh, well, if you do this, that might help. So we're still talking about opening that window of tolerance, socialization, any connection time, and it doesn't have to be forced connection time. I don't know, like if I'm hanging out with the girls, we don't need to be talking, we can just be hanging. Like my husband's like, what did you do? I don't know, but that's great, it was awesome, right? Like you don't have to do stuff. I'm getting to the end, so I'm just gonna tell you. So during COVID, another adult mental health story, when we were shut down, and I wasn't shut down, I still had to work at the hospital, but I had an adult, I think he did have autism, I'm not sure. He was an older adult, he lived in a group home, and he was in the hospital. He said, because of COVID and everything was shut down, he goes, I don't have very good social skills, Chris. He goes, so I just go places, like I go to the library, and that's my socialization. I go to the coffee shop and hang out, and that's my socialization. So when everything was shut down, he totally had no social connection. The happy thing is that he did find a way to, you know, fill that, but during COVID, he couldn't get it. And then for me, it was just a learning moment, like, yeah, we say this stuff, that was like in my face, yep, there it is, how important connection is. And we all get connection differently. It doesn't have to be that you have 100 friends, but just some kind of connection. One thing that I wanted to come back to, it's probably going to be unpopular. I don't know if it is for you guys, but it's not avoiding. Like we talked about, like when somebody's on hyperarousal, like maybe we do decrease the sensory stimulation, but we don't want to overuse avoidance. So I've had children, again, actually in my mental health work, I had a girl and I was seeing her in the pain program, but she actually had autism too. And she had never ate in the cafeteria, but it was her senior year and she wanted to go to prom. But she had never done those things like that. And this is where I said I was going to come back to OT's wanting your life out here. She wasn't going to go to prom. I mean, I could not convince her that she could do it. But throughout their lives, like I've seen a lot of children that don't eat in the cafeteria. But if we can expand and say, go in the cafeteria for 5 minutes and maybe expand on that. So when they're seniors and prom comes, that's something they can do. So we want to be careful not to allow too much avoidance. I had a child, another example is I had a child who, I'm not a fan of noise canceling headphones, but they're a tool, so you can use them, right? Parents asked about noise canceling headphones, I'm like, I'm not a big fan. But they did a lot of traveling, so he was in airports a lot, and they wanted him for the airport. Okay, go for it. You know, get some noise canceling headphones. So, and he was young, you guys. He was like 4. So he was using them in the airport, a lot of traveling. Then in preschool, there was a song he didn't like. So they started putting him on during the song he didn't like. Then circle time. He wasn't really a fan of sensory stimulation during circle time, so he wore his headphones. And pretty soon he was wearing his headphones 24/7. And then they're coming to me and saying, can you get rid of the headphones for us? Anyway, so they're a tool. Definitely use them if you need them, but recognize them as a tool and don't let it shrink your world. Use it as a tool to expand your world. So those were all ideas to open your window of tolerance. It's all those kind of foundational skills. We could talk about a sensory diet, opening your window of tolerance. People talk about sensory diets. I have taken a ton of courses on sensory diets. Like I could write a sensory diet in my sleep. although I don't have to because I have a ton of copies of them. Anyway, I don't do a lot of that anymore. I want your kids to get it as part of their day. I don't want to give a parent 20 more things, like I could like list 20 things for you to do during the day. I don't think any parent of a child with autism wants that. My children were typically developing, and I don't want that. Like, I don't want you giving me 20 more things to do my day. So we talk about, like, what does your child need in the morning? Your child's having a hard time waking up. What are some sensory things we can do to help with that? Like some, if they're really young, we might get them like a ice cold tart juice, like get it to them while they're in bed, like here, have some juice while you're in bed. But more things that you can incorporate easily, not things that you have to do. So I talked about higher arousal, lower arousal, some things to do. Opening the window of tolerance, I think that's what I want for these children more than anything. I want that optimal level of arousal to widen, to open that window for them. There's things I do in therapy that I didn't talk about here, but that's kind of talked about what you can do. So, any questions? Okay, you guys can always come and ask me, I'll be at my table.